The rain was battering the windows of the huge Lancaster mansion as Ronald entered the main hall, his face closed, irritation pulsing in every muscle. His day had been a disaster. The market was unstable, investors were pulling back, and to make matters worse, an unexpected lawsuit put his company at risk. He, the ruthless tycoon, who had never lost a battle, now saw his empire threatened. Not patient for the curious looks of the employees, he tore off his jacket and threw it on the marble stairs. The absolute silence of the house irritated him. He didn't like silence. It meant that something was out of his control. He turned to the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, without disguising his impatience. "Where's dinner?" Before she answered, a soft but firm voice came up behind him. "It is still being prepared, Mr. Lancaster." Ronald turned sharply. He didn't recognize that voice. And when his eyes met hers, he was surprised. Claire Matthews, the new maid. She didn't shrink under his gaze. Instead, he maintained his posture, holding a tray with a cup of tea. Her brown hair was tied in a scruffy bun, a few loose strands framing a delicate but determined face. "Who are you?" He frowned. "Claire. I started today." She approached and held out the tray. "Chamomile tea?" "Mrs. Wilkins said that you have headaches at night." Ronald arched an eyebrow, picking up the cup unhurriedly. "And do you think tea will solve my problems?" She gave a small smile. "Number, but it can help." He let out a low, mocking laugh. How many employees had crawled before him trying to please him? And yet, this woman spoke to him as if she were not in front of one of the most powerful men in the country. Claire noticed his gaze and lifted her chin without turning away. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes, sir." "Excuse me." She turned and left before he could answer. Ronald stood still for a few moments, still holding the cup. For the first time in a long time, he felt something that wasn't irritation or boredom. He felt curious. The next morning, Ronald walked down the stairs with firm steps, ready for another day of meetings and strategies to get around the crisis. His mood was as dark as the heavy clouds outside. He had never allowed professional problems to affect his routine, but this time, the discomfort was real. His mind worked fast, looking for solutions to keep his company afloat. Still, try as he might, one image kept invading his thoughts. Claire Matthews' steady eyes the night before. He found her in the kitchen wearing an apron, cutting fruit with precision. The soft morning light highlighted the loose strands of her brown hair and the serene trace of her expression. She didn't see him right away, which allowed him to watch her for a moment. There was something different about her. While the other employees looked away and maintained a rigid posture before him, Claire seemed oblivious to the presence of the ruthless tycoon that everyone feared. "Always so focused?" Ronald broke the silence. Claire looked up at him, unfazed. "Good morning, Mr. Lancaster." He noticed that she didn't answer his question, which drew a half smile from the corner. "What are you preparing?" "A nutritious breakfast." "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned that you often skip meals." Ronald leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "And you always take care of your boss's eating habits?" Claire wiped her hands on her apron and shrugged. "I'm not a doctor, but I know that working on an empty stomach can make a headache worse." Ronald narrowed his eyes. This woman had an answer for everything. "So, besides being a cook, you're now my private nurse?" "Just someone who observes things around him." She turned to the stove, as if the conversation was over. Ronald studied it for a moment. Claire was definitely not like the other employees. She didn't seem intimidated by him, nor did she try to impress him. "How long do you intend to work here?" he asked, not understanding the reason for his own curiosity. Claire turned around, surprised by the direct question. "The time needed." "Necessary for what?" She hesitated, then replied sincerely, "To help my sister." There was something in the way he said those words. A shadow, an invisible weight that Ronald realized effortlessly. For the first time, she felt like asking more, but before he could, an insistent ringing of his cell phone interrupted the moment. He answered, without taking his eyes off her. "Lancaster." On the other end of the line, Harrison sounded tense. "We need to talk." Now Ronald closed the expression, his problems coming back to the surface. "I'm going." He hung up and walked away from the counter. "It seems that work is calling me," he said, taking the car key. Claire just nodded, going back to what she was doing. No questions, no curiosity, no flattery. When Ronald left the kitchen, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he had left something behind but a trail of irritation. He left curiosity, and that bothered him more than any financial crisis. Ronald has always had a clear rule. He doesn't get involved with employees. For him, employees were parts of a system that needed to work efficiently. He had no time for distractions or getting to know the people who worked for him. But Claire Matthews, she was different. Over the next few days, he tried to ignore her. He had bigger problems to solve. His company was still at risk. Investors were restless, and lawyers were trying to turn the tide. But somehow, Claire always emerged at the most unexpected moments as a subtle, silent force that refused to be ignored. One morning, when he went down to the cafe, he found her in the library. She was standing, arranging books on the highest shelf, balancing on her tiptoes. "You know we have stairs for that, right?" Ronald commented, leaning back against the doorframe. Claire turned and smiled slightly. "And missed the opportunity for a little morning challenge?" "No, thank you." He arched his eyebrow. Since when did reaching a book become a challenge? She took the volume she wanted and went down with grace without looking away from him. Forever. Small challenges prepare us for big ones. Ronald folded his arms, studying her. Philosophical first thing in the morning. Just realistic. She put the book aside and went back to what she was doing. Her carefree attitude disconcerted him. He was used to waiters who bowed their heads, who hurriedly walked away when they saw him enter. Claire, on the other hand, moved as if his presence didn't bother her. "Are you always like this?" he asked suddenly. She stopped, turning to him. "Just how?" Calm, without fear of responding. Claire tilted her head slightly, as if pondering. "I respect people, Mr. Lancaster, but I'm not afraid of them." The answer was up in the air for a moment. Ronald was supposed to go to his meeting, but for some reason he stayed there. "This is new." "What?" "People who don't fear me." Claire smiled. "Fear can be useful, but it is not always necessary." Ronald let out a short laugh. "You're full of answers, aren't you?" "Is it a problem?" He watched her for a moment longer before taking a step back, as if he were walking away from something dangerous. "I haven't decided yet." And with that, he left the library, not realizing that he was carrying something he didn't expect, the memory of Claire's smile. The following days brought unexpected tension for Ronald. He had never allowed personal distractions, but now, unintentionally, he found himself too attentive to every little detail of Claire Matthews. The way she straightened her hair when she was concentrated. The way his answers were direct, but never disrespectful. The firm gaze that defied his coldness without fear. That was dangerous. He tried to dispel any thought of her, plunging further into the chaos of the company. The meetings were endless and the problems were constant. But in those rare moments when he came home late at night, exhausted and frustrated, he always found something that made him stop. Like on that rainy night. Ronald entered the mansion in a bad mood. The board of directors was divided. Some investors wanted to get out, and he still had to deal with the press pressing for answers. Was the ruthless Ronald Lancaster finally losing ground? He passed through the hallway and saw light in the kitchen. It was late, too late for any employee to still be there. Moved by curiosity, he followed the soft sounds and stopped at the door. Claire was sitting at the table with a mug of tea in her hands. The apron was on the back of the chair and the hair was loose. She didn't notice his presence right away. She just stared at the window, as if lost in thought. "Do you always stay up late?" His voice broke the silence. She looked up, unsurprised. "And you always arrive so late?" He entered the kitchen, pulling a chair unceremoniously. "Work. I thought billionaires had time to sleep." Ronald let out a low, humorless laugh. "If I slept like any ordinary person, my company would have already sunk." Claire took a sip of the tea before replying, "And is it worth it?" He frowned. "What? What do you sacrifice to keep this company going?" The question remained in the air. Ronald always knew the answer. Everything. But I had never said it out loud. I have no choice. He looked away. There is always choice. Not always. He rested his elbows on the table, tired. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. In fact, for the first time in a long time, Ronald felt something different. Claire Quebrew is quiet. Tea. He hesitated for a second before accepting the cup she offered. It was the first time in years that someone had done something for him without expecting anything in return, and that baffled him. Ronald has always been a man of absolute control. In his company, his word was law. In the business world, his name inspired respect and fear. He never allowed anything to interfere with his routine, let alone personal distractions. But now, he found himself increasingly attentive to Claire Matthews. Over the next few days, he tried to maintain his usual posture, but he couldn't help but look for her around the house. If he saw her organizing something in the main hall, his eyes would follow her without her noticing. If I passed through the kitchen and heard his voice among the other servants, I felt an inexplicable impulse to enter. And worse, when he arrived late and found the kitchen empty, he felt a twinge of frustration when he realized that Claire wasn't there. That was a problem. One evening, after an exhausting meeting, Ronald came into the house and saw an unusual scene. Claire sitting in the garden, reading under the dim light of the streetlight next to the bench. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, going up to the room and pretending that the sight didn't intrigue him. But as if his feet had a will of their own, he crossed the cobblestone path and stopped before her. Always alone at night. Claire looked up from the book and smiled slightly. Some people like silence. He tilted his head, studying it. "Aren't you afraid to stay out here?" She closed the book calmly. "Should you?" Ronald let out a low laugh, sitting next to her without asking permission. "Most of the people who work for me are afraid to even look me in the eye." "And you like that?" Claire asked without hesitation. The question took Ronald by surprise. He looked at the darkness ahead before replying, "I always thought that respect and fear went together. They don't walk." He turned his face to face her. "You're really not afraid of me, are you?" Claire gave a small but true smile. "If I had, I wouldn't be here." Her sincerity disarmed him in a way that nothing else could. He was used to power plays, manipulations, and strategies. But Claire spoke to him with no hidden intentions, no flattery, no fear. And that attracted him in a dangerous way. "What were you reading?" He pointed to the book. She picked it up and showed the cape. "Wuthering Heights." Ronald arched his eyebrow. "A tragic love story." Some loves are born of tragedy. Her gaze met his. For a moment, only silence enveloped them. Ronald never believed in fate or anything like that. But that night, as he sat next to Claire under the dark sky, he felt that something was about to change. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight it. Ronald was always a practical man. He never saw the need for extravagant social events, but he knew they were important tools in the business world. A game of appearances. That night, the mansion was in an uproar. A charity event would bring together influential businessmen, politicians, and investors. It was the perfect opportunity for Ronald to show that he was still in control, despite rumors about his company being in crisis. He came downstairs in a sleek black suit, his gaze sharp as ever. The hall was already filled with guests chatting and smiling falsely. But when his eyes landed on Claire, for a moment, everything else disappeared. She wore a simple navy blue dress, but one that enhanced her understated beauty. Her hair was tied in a low bun, with a few loose strands. Unlike any woman there, she didn't try to impress anyone, and perhaps that's why it caught his attention so much. Ronald frowned when he saw her talking to one of the guests, Daniel Crawford, a young businessman who loved to show off his charisma. He leaned slightly towards Claire, smiling confidently. Something bothered Ronald immediately. He never worried about who spoke to whom inside his house. But the sight of Claire laughing softly at Daniel made something grow inside him. Jealousy. It was an impulse. Without thinking, Ronald crossed the room and approached the two. "Claire, can I talk to you?" His voice came out firm, with no room for refusal. She blinked, surprised by the interruption, but nodded. Of course. Without even looking at Daniel, Ronald guided her to a more reserved corner of the room. When they stopped, Claire crossed her arms and arched her eyebrow. "Are you okay?" Ronald let out a short, humorless laugh. "Since when have you been talking to my guests?" She tilted her head, analyzing him. "He just started a conversation. I didn't know it was forbidden." It's not forbidden. He ran his hand through his hair, annoyed with himself. Then why are you acting like this? Ronald clenched his jaw. He was not a man who explained himself. But in front of Claire, he felt he needed a justification. Crawford is not trustworthy. He flirts with every woman he meets. Claire Sariou Delev. You're jealous? The word hit him like a punch. Don't be ridiculous. She kept her gaze steady on his. Then why are you so bothered? Ronald took a deep breath. He could ignore that. I could turn my back and pretend I didn't feel anything. But the truth was simple and straightforward. Claire challenged him in a way no other person had ever done, and that drove him crazy. I don't like games, Claire. Me neither. Her gaze softened. Then stop running away from what you feel. Ronald was silent. For the first time, he didn't have a sharp answer. Before he could react, one of the investors approached, calling him for a conversation. Claire took a step back, but before she left, she said softly, "If you need me, you know where to find me." And with that, he turned and disappeared among the guests. Ronald stood there, a disturbing thought echoing in his mind. Yes, he knew where to find her. The problem was admitting that I wanted that. The night of the ball passed, but what happened between Ronald and Claire was marked. He tried to get it out of his head, sinking into work, endless meetings, numbers, and contracts, but nothing seemed to dispel the memory of the last exchange of glances between them. And then, the next morning, he saw her again. Ronald was in his upstairs study looking out the window when he noticed Claire discreetly stepping out into the garden. The ball gown had been replaced by a comfortable outfit, and her hair was loose, dancing in the light evening wind. He didn't think twice. He went downstairs and followed the same path. When she arrived at the garden, Claire was sitting on the wooden bench, hugging her knees. She turned her head when she felt his presence, but she didn't seem surprised. "Insomnia?" she asked, with a small smile. "Something like that." He sat down next to her. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was loaded with something unsaid. Ronald ran his hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I'm not an easy man, Claire." "I know." He turned his face to face her. "And yet, are you still here?" She smiled slightly, looking up at the stars. "You don't understand, do you?" "What?" She finally turned to him. "You hide behind this cold, unreachable man's mask, but I see through it." Ronald's chest tightened. He never allowed anyone to get so close as to see beyond what he showed. "Claire, you can try to fight it, Ronald. But the truth is already clear to both of us." His heart raced. He was always a rational, practical man. But there, under the dark sky, with Claire so close, everything looked different. He raised his hand as if to touch it, but hesitated. Claire noticed. With a soft gaze, she raised her own hand and rested it on his, breaking the distance. Ronald felt the warmth of that touch, so simple yet so devastating. "I don't know how to be that kind of man," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "Claire saw you. Then learn." He looked at her for a long moment and then, without thinking, without allowing reason to stop him, he approached slowly, and for the first time in a long time, Ronald Lancaster did not shy away from what he felt. The distance between Ronald and Claire dissolved in an instant. The man who had always controlled everything in his life now surrendered to the unexpected. His lips hovered close to hers, and for a brief moment, Ronald hesitated. It was dangerous. He never allowed anyone to approach like that. But Claire wasn't just anyone. She did not back down. There was no fear in his eyes, just that serene certainty that, whatever happened, she would not run away. And then finally Ronald relented. His lips touched hers in a slow, hesitant kiss, as if she was discovering something she never knew she needed, different from everything. Claire returned unhurriedly, her fingers sliding smoothly down the back of his neck. There was no rush, there was no urgency, there was only feeling. As they walked away, Ronald kept his eyes closed for a second, taking it in. When he opened them, he found Claire watching him with a soft smile. "So," she muttered, "was it that hard?" He let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You like to tease me, don't you?" "I just like to see you let your guard down." He held her face gently, his thumbs brushing against her soft skin. How long had he not felt this? That lightness, that peace. But then, reality hit. He pulled back a little, running his hand through his hair. "Claire, you..." She waited patiently. Ronald took a deep breath. He didn't know how to be that kind of man. He didn't know how to allow anyone to see him for what he was, with all the flaws, the scars, the shadows. "I don't want to hurt you." Claire's smile softened. "Then don't hurt yourself." So simple, so different from everything he knew. Ronald watched her for a moment before letting out a long sigh. "I need time." Claire nodded. "I understand." She stood up, giving him one last look before going back inside the house. Ronald stood there, looking up at the sky, feeling a new weight inside him. He always controlled everything. He always knew how to manipulate situations, how to protect himself. But for the first time, he wanted to take a risk. He wanted to learn to be different. By Claire. Over the next few days, Ronald tried to convince himself that that kiss didn't change anything. But it was a lie, and he knew it. Every time he saw Claire around the house, his heart reacted before his mind. Every time I heard her laughter echoing through the halls, I felt an inexplicable heat. And every time he thought about ignoring her feelings, he remembered what she had said. Then learn. But how do you learn something that he never allowed himself to feel? The fear was real. Not the fear of failing in business, not the fear of losing your reputation, but the fear of trusting, of opening up to someone and perhaps being rejected. So he hesitated, for days, until on a silent night he found Claire again in the garden. She was sitting on the same bench, hugging a cup of hot tea, staring into the darkness. When he heard his footsteps, he did not turn around. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to sit down?" Ronald let out a sigh and sat down next to her. "I was a coward." She smiled slightly. "Yes, it was." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You don't make it easy for me, do you? You don't need someone to make it easy. It needs someone to stay." Those words hit deeply. Ronald ran his hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "I'm not good at this, Claire." She turned to him. "No one is." Her eyes were full of patience, but also of a firmness that Ronald admired. Claire never demanded anything from him. She just waited. He waited for him to be ready to choose. And at that moment, Ronald realized he had already chosen a long time ago. He raised his hand and held hers. It wasn't an impulsive gesture. It was a decision. A silent promise that, no matter how hard it was, he would try. Claire squeezed his hand back, speechless, unhurried. And under the night sky, Ronald Lancaster knew his life would never be the same. But for the first time, he didn't want it to be.